Dr. Turton, he has been a soldier, a spy. He is also a natural scholar. He has a natural tendency towards scholarship. He is a scientist and an environmental advisor. And he recently moved to Perth from South Africa, where he was professor at the University of the Free State Centre for Environmental Management. He works at the interface between hard science and policy making, and he specialises in water resource management as a strategic issue. And Dr. Turton is on the editorial board of the journal Water Policy, which is the official journal of the World Water Council. He is also a military veteran of the South African border wars. And he is the new chairman of the Western Australian region of SANVOA. That's the South African Military Veterans Organisation of Australasia. And you've probably guessed from the splendid military display in this hall that this venue is their home base in Perth. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Okay, good. Good evening to you all. Has it kicked in? We've got to let the technology kick in.
Yes.
We've got to Bluetooth it all. I learned about blue teeth. I used to think that blue teeth was like a hemorrhagic fever that you got in the Congo or something like that. But I've now found out that blue teeth is something else. Okay, right. Good evening to you all. Yeah. Thank you. It's always a great privilege to stand before an audience like this. I'm humbled when you introduce me like that. The word spy is such an ugly word. I send shivers down my spine. I was an intelligence operator. That's what I was. I was an operator specializing in deep penetration. That's what I did. I was an operator. Spy is an ugly word. So I was asked to speak tonight about water, and Joe was very specific. He said, Turton, you don't talk technical stuff to these people. Don't talk chemistry, don't talk physics, don't talk pH, don't talk that stuff, okay? So I'm not allowed to talk that stuff. So therefore, now Marion said, no, I must talk that stuff, okay? So now, nonetheless, this is not going to be a technical talk about water. It's going to be a talk about what actually is water, what is the significance of water, and insofar as it makes a difference, I'm going to tell you my little story of life, of my journey into water. I normally start by saying that floating in the lifeless infinity of outer space, amongst all of the known planets, all of the known solar systems, the entire universe, the entire known universe, there's only one planet that's blue. There's only one planet in the known universe, although that's starting to change now. We're starting to learn more about other planets in other solar systems, in other, in other galaxies. But certainly when I was born, we didn't know about any other planet that had water in both liquid, gaseous, or liquid gas and solid forms. And I find that kind of fascinating. And as a small boy, I was born into a family of military veterans, and I was always a very, very inquisitive person. My father was a big game hunter. He was an elephant and a buffalo hunter. So as a small boy, I was privileged to go hunting in what is known as the Okavango Delta, the Okavango region. And the Okavango is one of those most incredible parts of Africa. Africa's got 53 rivers that cross international political borders, and 10% of those rivers don't flow into the ocean. They're known as endorrheic systems. They don't flow into the sea. They flow into an inland entity, typically a wetland system. So the Okavango is one of those wetland systems. There are a couple of in Botswana and Angola, Namibian area. But nonetheless, as a small boy, I found myself sitting around the campfire in the Kalahari with these hunters, hunting buffalo and doing what their normal thing. And so sitting in this little circle of around a campfire, this massive skies of the southern hemisphere open above me. And any of you that come from Africa will know that the campfire, we watch the television of the desert. We watch the campfire, the sparks going. And this is much like people have done for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, life together around the campfire. And I was sitting there listening. My father was a veteran of the Battle of El Alamein, the campaign in North Africa, and I would listen to some of his war stories. They never spoke much about it, but on occasion I'd listen to it. And as this little boy, I remember feeling the warmth of my body facing the fire and the cold on the back part of my body facing the outer desert. And looking up at the sky, and one of the reasons why I love living in Australia is because of the Southern Cross. I can identify with the Southern Cross. That's very much part of my identifying features. And I remember sitting there, listening in the distance to the roar of the lion, to the mournful hoot of the owl, to the insane laughter of the hyena, and listen to all this chattering noise. And here I am sitting in a desert, but we're at the distal end of a complex river system that starts in Angola, that crosses over into Namibia, and eventually into Botswana, and ends up in the Kalahari Desert. And it's a river that's got the most beautiful quality water, pristine quality water, and it loses 98% of the total volume of water is lost to evaporation. And when it eventually does overflow, it's intercepted by all sorts of tectonic activities, all sorts of rifting and faulting. In fact, it's found at the southern end of the Great Rift Valley of Africa, where Africa is ripping apart. So the Okavango Delta is formed by the southern element, the southern tip of the Great Rift Valley. And as a small boy, I was just amazed. I was utterly amazed. And what I realized as a small boy, I came to this profound moment of realization that as an individual, I am utterly insignificant. I am insignificant as an individual, but I'm not irrelevant. My relevance is derived from being part of a greater whole, being part of this bigger thing around me. So significance and relevance at the age of 10, 12, I was thinking about these things. So I've always been a thinking person. But nonetheless, it was there that I learned about the value of water flowing through a desert landscape, understanding the lifeblood, understanding the livelihoods. And at that point in time, diamonds had just been discovered in Botswana. So the mining industry moved in, the Orapa diamond mine moved in. And there were plans afoot to create a pipeline of water from the Okavango Delta down to the Orapa diamond mine. And that is the first sort of exposure that I had to this water as an economic enabler versus water as a social good. Versus water as something that enables civilizations to exist versus something that enables an economy to grow and develop and modernize in a mining-based world in an arid climate. And that's where my early roots came from. But then later on, if I fast forward that now, I had the dubious privilege of fighting a war in the upper reaches of that very same river basin, the Okavango. We fought a war in the upper reaches of the basin. And subsequently, I found myself as a peacemaker, going to the same area, making peace with my former enemy around the same issue, around water. So water as a vehicle for peacemaking, water as a vehicle for bridging divides, water as a more than a social good, as an emotional good, as a spiritual thing. And I learned about that in the upper reaches of the Okavango. And this took me on a very, very interesting journey because we went into different parts of the world. So I'm going to go down a rabbit hole now, and I'll take you down a couple of the different warrens of this rabbit hole. So the first warren of this rabbit hole took me into the Middle East. The Middle East, divided place. Deeply, profoundly divided place. Just before we were having a meal here now, I was talking to someone here about Yemen. So I find myself in the Yemen, one of the deeply divided community, most deeply, profoundly divided community, a tribal community, an Islamic community, but divided. And I did some work in that part of the world, and that exposed me to water as a religious thing. Water, the value of water, or the perceptions of water as a religious artifact. And what struck me when working in the Arab world is that whenever you go down any of the streets in an Arab environment, you'll see these big clay amphora jugs of water outside the front house, the front door, and anyone can come and take that water. So water is something that I eventually learned through my exposure in Yemen. I learned through a group of what were known as the Zaidi scholars. And I was working for the World Bank at that point in time, and I advised the World Bank to work closely with these Zaidi scholars to try and understand the Sharia law, Islamic law, and what it means to intercept the flow of water. Because there are all sorts of cultural and spiritual values that come out of that flow of water. So that was the one little sort of warren that I went down. It was a very, very interesting one, but I learned a huge amount of stuff there. And I linked up with a very interesting guy. I've linked up with many interesting people, but one of the interesting people that I linked up with was an Israeli former paratrooper. His name is Aaron Wolf, Professor Aaron Wolf at Oregon State University. And he was in the Lebanon as a paratrooper during one of the many wars between Israel and the Arabs. And at that point in time, there was word put out that the Israelis were diverting the water from the Jordan River. And we now hear the same happening between India and Pakistan. So there's a parallel there. So I teamed up with Aaron Wolf, and we became close allies, and we created a thing called the University's Partnership for Transboundary Waters. And that was a very, very interesting development because we linked in now to the US State Department, we linked into a whole lot of different places. And through Aaron Wolf's work, he created a thing called the TFDD, the Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database. And this is just now a massive, massive resource. And that Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database has listed every single incident in the history of humankind that is associated with water as a driver of conflict or water as a driver of peace. And Aaron later on, as a Jewish man, later on took a sabbatical from his university, and he went to go and embed himself with a Bedouin tribe. And he spent an entire sabbatical with Bedouins, with Arabs, learning about their cultural value of water. So the spiritual healing value and the linking value of that is something quite profound. So forgive me for jumping around, but that takes me now to what I've recently learned about Western Australia. Dave, over there, my colleague, has recently given me a book to read about water and mining in the Pilbara and the Aboriginal values, Aboriginal First Nation rights. I come from a country where First Nations are not insignificant, but they're not as well defined as here. Our First Nations in South Africa are largely extinct. They largely don't exist anymore. Whereas in Australia, you've got these very, very profound cultural values that go back for tens of thousands of years. And in an instant of an eye, these things are changed when a mining operation moves in. And this now it introduced me to a whole new dimension of water. Water as a risk. Water as a fundamental risk. Water as a risk and an opportunity. Water as a corporate risk. Water as a risk to civilization. And I'll go down that little rabbit hole a little bit more, and I'll take you now to a couple of years ago, I was invited to Australia to the Burdekin River Forum. There's a thing called the Burdekin River Forum. And they invited me to come and talk to them. The CSIRO invited me out to Australia, and I was thinking about what am I going to tell these people that they don't already know about water. These are sugarcane farmers. They know a huge amount about water. They know pretty much what you need to know about modern thinking of water. But they didn't understand the cultural value of water. So I thought what I can tell them about is a sensitivity to the cultural value of water. And I gave them, in my presentation, I used PowerPoint back in those days, and I went back to a time in my professional career when I was now starting to ride the crest of the wave in my professional world. Water as a national security risk was my field. And I was invited one day by a professor, a history professor, who invited me to an industrial wasteland, an absolute industrial wasteland, a place called Vereniging South Africa on the Vaal River, near a place called Sasol, the oil refinery place, okay? And in this industrial wasteland, you will not get a bigger industrial wasteland than that. It's polluted with every conceivable thing you could think of. And there were these three big ash tips from a power station, from a coal-burning power station. And these ash tips have now been left derelict, and people are now mining them. They're making ash cinder blocks. They're making building materials out of them. And this place is just absolutely destitute, absolutely, there's just no ecological functionality there at all. But the significance is the following. Within this industrial wasteland, between those three ash tips, there was a big granite outcrop, a granitic basement granite outcrop. Now, basement granite is important because that's what the Earth's made of. So and everything above the basement granite has been eroded away for a long period of time. And there's a river there called the Vaal River. And the Vaal River, Vaal in Afrikaans means Vaal rivier, it means a dirty brown river. It's a river with lots of sediment in it. And that Vaal River has been flowing now for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions of years. And on that rock, there were First Nations that came there tens of thousands of years ago, and that was a religious site for those First Nation people. And that's the first exposure I had to First Nation culture in South Africa. And what amazed me now was on this granitic monolith sticking out of the ground, because I understand the interface between surface water and groundwater, and I understand how water moves in a landscape, I could suddenly interpret the landscape, and I realized that the water goes through the ground, through the clay, through the soil, the sand pile, until it reaches the basement granite, and then it flows along, and where the basement granite comes to the surface, it forces the water up, and you get a little spring there. And because it's a spring in an otherwise profoundly arid area, where water security defines livelihoods, defines life, they knew that they could find life there, they could find water. And that became their holy place, the place that they went for spiritual cleansing. And they drilled holes in this rock. How, I don't know. But this granite, hard granite, they drilled holes in it, and they did all kinds of things. And when I was researching for that Burdekin paper, I was quite amazed to see the very artifacts that we saw, the very petroglyphs that we saw carved on that rock, were carved in Peru, were carved in the Mexico area, were carved, in fact, in different parts of Australia. There's certain Aboriginal artifacts, certain things like beetles, scarab beetles, for example, and certain animals that you only found there, but then other animals that you would find more universally. So one can only interpret this as this history professor asked me what I thought of this. And I mean, I'm not an archaeologist, I don't know about these things. I'm not an anthropologist, but I just had a sense that this is a profoundly significant place. And the significance is as follows. Here in an industrial wasteland, a century of mining has come and gone. It's over. But in that industrial wasteland, surviving in that wasteland, has been these artifacts of tens of thousands of years old. And the one question that it caused me to ask is, how much is enough? How much is enough? How much water is enough? So if you're one of those Aboriginal people, those First Nation people that went to that sacred place to go and pray to their deities, whatever their deities were, they went to go and pay respects to their deity. And their needs were very small. They needed maybe a litre of water per person per day. That's what their requirement was. And here we were in an industrial area where the requirements were thousands of litres per day to keep those machines going. So you got this complete disparity between 1 litre per person per day versus tens of thousands of litres to keep an industrial economy going. And in between that, you're going to have a series of clashes, a series of cultural disparities. So where can we say, what is enough? What is enough? And how much is enough? And that took me on a very interesting journey because I was deeply involved at that point in time. I mentioned earlier on, I'm an ex-intelligence officer. And I'll just tell you the intelligence side of the story because it's an interesting angle to it. I'll bring that rabbit hole back to this intelligence thing now. When, in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. I gave a talk here a while ago on the Berlin Wall coming down. And I had the privilege of being a guy there when the wall came down. That's another talk. But the significance was the Berlin Wall came down, the Cold War came to an end. And at that point in time, the world was stunned, much like it is stunned today. We're just going through stunning revelations that what we thought were our allies are no longer our allies. There are these stunning tectonic events taking place. But at that point in time, the CIA was one of the biggest intelligence services, one of the most sophisticated intelligence services, one of the most well-resourced intelligence services. And all intelligence services liaise with each other. And at that point in time, the CIA decided to launch an operation to link up with other intelligence services to ask a couple of questions for joint consideration. And this joint consideration is, what is the security landscape going to look like in a post-Cold War world? For the last 50 years, we've had a Cold War. We've understood what the Cold War is about. What's going to happen after the Cold War? And I put my hand up. I said, I want to be part of that thing. And that took me down a professional route that was, in my view, of great professional significance to me, because I now managed to link up with some of the top national security people in the world. And I volunteered to take responsibility for water. I said, right, I'm the water guy, I'll do the water stuff. And I linked up now with a whole bunch of really cutting-edge people, cutting-edge strategic thinkers. And I started developing this water as a national security risk model. And I regard that probably as the pinnacle of my professional career, because we could now start understanding what the underlying issues are in a water-constrained economy that is mining-based, but also happens to be extremely arid, where the future policy options are all about developing mining, which is automatically going to be in conflict with First Nation rights. And if we start looking now, I'm not yet fully an Aussie citizen. My accent hasn't yet adapted, but I'm very proud and very happy that the Australian government has opened their arms to me and given me permission to live here. And I'm doing my best to integrate. And part of that is I'm learning about Australia. I'm learning about Australian waters. I'm not an expert in any way about Australian water, but I bring with me this perspective, this global perspective, because I was a deputy governor of the World Water Council, and I'm still an editor of their journal. I'm about to reach a milestone, having processed 480 papers, peer-reviewed papers that I've processed in my professional time with them. And I shouldn't say it on air now, but I'm going to hang up my boots at some point in time. And I'm going to hang up my boots. I'm looking at the 500 marker. When I get 500, I'm probably going to consider now retiring from that space. But nonetheless, that has given me a global insight into perspectives. And so wherever I go now, I can come in. For example, I'll give just one example. There was a thing called the millennial drought in Australia. You heard about the millennial drought? And I was invited by the then Minister of Water from the state of Victoria, a guy called Ian Braithwaite. And he invited me out as an advisor to Vic Water, the water utility in the state of Victoria. They supply Melbourne. And I was very excited to get this invitation, and I had a privilege of working with Mr. Braithwaite, Professor Dr. Braithwaite, for a period of time after that. I introduced him to some of the South African problems, and at that point in time, just to refresh your memory, Cape Town, the city of Cape Town, had just gone through a thing called Day Zero. And Day Zero was that moment in time it became the first city in the world to literally face the probability of not having water in their taps. And because I do a lot of media work, I did an interview on BBC TV, and BBC flew me down. They got lots of resources. They flew me down from Johannesburg, and they flew me down to Cape Town, and they put me in an Olympic-sized swimming pool that was empty. Now, just for visual impact. So they interviewed me in an empty Olympic-sized swimming pool, and asked me to talk about this water thing. And that BBC interview was flashed around BBC. It went around the globe instantly, and within 24 hours, I got messages from Canada, messages from New Zealand, messages from Australia, requests for interviews, etc., because these countries are profoundly concerned about this Day Zero scenario. And that was my early professional exposure now to, in this case, the state of Victoria and their water. So with this as a background now, all this is a background, I'm going to just tell you some of my professional opinions and my professional perspectives. So this is an opinion, but it's a professional opinion. It's not just a thumbsuck opinion. It's an opinion based on on a significant amount of baseline knowledge. And the first thing that I would like to say is that water is an economic enabler. Without water as a foundation, you don't have civilization. If you go back to the development, the evolution of civilization, civilization as we know it today goes back to the Chaldees, Ur of the Chaldees, Babylon, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, Iraq, Iran. Think about that, the wars that they've had. That is the origin of civilization as we know it. And it was in that place that an important lesson was learned. Lessons about how to create water security in a profoundly arid environment. And subsequent to that, I've been learning a lot about the Chinese. The Chinese, not to be outdone, the Chinese also have a very ancient water civilization. And in fact, I don't know if you know this, if I had a PowerPoint here, I would show you. The Chinese have, they've got these symbols, these pictures that they use for their writing, and they've got one symbol for a river, and it looks like that. It's the fingers of a hand, and it refers clearly. You can see in your mind it's the tributaries of a river that flows into a point. And they've got another symbol, it's a square, hard, perfectly geometrical, with two little horns on it. So I think of a square with two little raised pieces on each corner, and that's a dike. That's a dike that controls flooding in a river. And if you put those two symbols together, you get a whole new Chinese world, political order. So there's an important message there. The control over water creates political stability, and from political stability comes the capacity to develop economic capabilities to convert your mineral resources, your natural resources into something of economic value, to develop society and to evolve society into a more civilized direction, for want of a better word. So there's that element of water that is, I think, profoundly important. And I think that is now starting to come to the fore because the world is now literally running out of water. And I mentioned in the opening statement that floating in this lifeless infinity of outer space is this one blue planet, the one blue planet that's covered in water. So if we just take a rough split, let's call it 2/3 of the planet is covered by ocean, and 1/3 maybe between 1/3 and 1/4 is covered by land. And we, Homo sapiens, wise man, we've chosen to live on the land, not in the water. We've chosen to live on the land. And Homo sapiens, the so-called the pinnacle of civilization, we've chosen to play God with water. We've chosen to understand the fundamental flows. We understand how to obstruct that flow, how to redirect that flow, how to do things with water. That is quite extraordinary. And if we zoom in now to this, what's happening in Western Australia. I've been coming here to Perth for probably 18 years, back and forth, because my son immigrated here 18 years ago, so I've been probably coming here for 15 years. He first settled down before I came, and I've had the privilege of seeing the city grow in 15 years, quite remarkably. And because I come in and go, and come in again, I get these sort of, these instantaneous snapshot views, and then I go away, and then the video happens behind me, and then I come back and get another snapshot picture. So I remember when Perth only had 1 or 2 high-rise buildings, now it's got a whole bunch more. So Perth is growing very, very rapidly. And Perth has got incredible challenges. And one of the challenges is that Perth is located in one of the better watered areas of Western Australia. The southwestern part of Western Australia is one of the better watered areas. It happens to be a forest. That forest happens to be of great significance because of the way it retains water, the way it captures water, the way it diverts water into groundwater, etc., etc. So on the one hand, you've got this clash now between the need for water corporation to grow rapidly and to supply water over an increasingly large footprint. And the only place that I know of, in my personal experience, that is similar to Perth is the Johannesburg-Pretoria conurbation. But it's orders of magnitude different. Perth has got, maybe 1.8 million people living here. Johannesburg's got to many, many more million, 12 million, something like that, people living there. So Johannesburg has got a conurbation. If you go along the Witwatersrand complex, the Witwatersrand gold mining areas that straddle the continental watershed divide, 5,000 feet above sea level, in an arid area much like West Australia. Very arid area, grassland, no trees growing, no trees at all in that part of the world, just grassland, and grassland that comes and goes. I talk about these First Nation people that would go to that sacred site in the Vaal River, and that Vaal River became the artery of economic development in South Africa, that very same river. So Aboriginal people went there thousands of years ago knowing that in this variable landscape of drought and floods, you will always find reliable supply of water at that one place where the granite comes to the surface. And here we have the same thing in Australia, because in the case of the Witwatersrand goldfields, from what's known as the East Rand, Germiston, Springs, Brakpan, Benoni, each of them are towns in their own, cities in their own right. Cities in their own right. They're all supplied by Rand Water Board, which I'm still an advisor to this day. And Rand Water is one of the biggest water utilities in the world. Not in Africa, in the world. And it's not only do they supply the far East Rand, they supply the extreme far East Rand, where you go to Secunda, the second site of Sasol, the main oil and gas ability in South Africa. So Secunda is hundreds of kilometers away from the source of supply. They've got these pipelines snaking across the landscape. But then if you go to the west, they go out to Randfontein, Krugersdorp, Carltonville, western area. So from east to west, it's a few hundred kilometers of urban conurbation. So here, if you go to Perth, I mean, this evening I came here, I got into a traffic jam because there's some sports event taking place in the stadium here. So the traffic jams there are 1,000 times worse because it happens all the time, because you've got many, many more people living there. So from a utilities corporation perspective, the challenge is, how do you get water? How do you sustain that supply? How do you deliver it over a rapidly expanding footprint? And then as that footprint expands, so the pollution load increases. So you are actually damaging your own resource, and you literally, it's like going to the gym and having an overzealous personal trainer that wants to get you to lose your belly at a rate faster than what you are willing to lose your belly. And they put you on the treadmill, and they keep cranking that treadmill up. That treadmill just keeps on going faster, and you can't stop. That's what the utilities corporation's like. They can't stop. And because the population density is relatively low, and because the footprint is very, very big, the number of people per square kilometer that's paying for all this stuff is relatively small. So your economics starts kicking in, and all kinds of issues now start coming in. So the good news is, in my humble professional opinion, Water Corp is one of the best water utility providers that I'm aware of. They're highly adaptive. They're on top of very, very complex things. And we start getting into the good news side. The good news now is, I'm going to take you another little part of my underground rabbit's hole. One day I opened up my email, and there I got an invitation from the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. Okay? These are the people that give the Nobel Prize. And instantly they had my attention. And I was invited to an event, and the event was the Lifetime Achievement Award of a famous Swedish scientist called Professor Malin Falkenmark. And I didn't know it at the time, but Falkenmark was going to be given this Lifetime Achievement Award. And as part of her prize, the committee said that she can invite 10 people from anywhere in the world that have taken her work to another level. And I was one of those 10 people. So I was the only guy from Africa that was invited to that esteemed place. And it was just one of those profound moments in my life, because here I found myself in this hall, in this private, almost like a drawing room, surrounded by these oil paintings of Linnaeus. If any of you are into the natural sciences, you know Linnaeus, one of the guys that was into early taxonomy. So here I'm standing in front of this, the oil painting of Linnaeus, humbled by his presence. And here we are sitting there with, in the presence of Marlon Falkenmark. And Marlon's work was central to my work on water as a national security risk. And I'll tell you what it is now. Marlon, as a young woman, I will say this, I don't want to get into a gendered conversation here, but I will say that she asked a very clever question that no man that I ever knew at that point in time thought to ask. She asked a very clever question. And she said, is there a finite limit to the number of people that a given unit of water can sustain? Yes or no? Simple yes or no question. In other words, is there, in agricultural terms or in livestock terms, is there a carrying capacity? That's the question that she asked. And no one could give her the answer. So she did her work with that. And the significance of Marlon was she became one of the top scientists, because I don't know if you know anything about Sweden, but the Swedish Foreign Ministry always gets involved in international affairs, and they always punch way above their weight. So they're a relatively small country, but they always get involved in big things. And they always, they're game changers. So they go in there in their box and they make a difference. And there was a thing called the World Summit on Sustainable Development, the Rio conference. And she was one of the Swedish leaders to that conference. And it was there that she asked these questions, and no one could give her the answers. So a couple of things came out of it. The first thing that came out was she launched a program that looked at every country in the world. And she looked at the water resource availability of every country. And she quantified that, and she developed a common denominator. And that common denominator was what she called a flow unit, a common flow unit. So she wanted to compare apples to apples. So she said, how many flow units are there in this country? And a flow unit is 1 million cubic meters of water per annum. So how many million cubic meters of water per annum does this country have compared to that country, compared to that country? Then she looked at the population, and she divided the population into the number of flow units, and she developed what is known as a hydraulic density of population. And the hydraulic density of population is a profound thing, because it tells us how many people can survive off a given unit of water. And I'll give you some numbers now. It gets very interesting now, because another guy in the room was my dear professor, my dear, very close friend of mine, a man called Tony Allen, Professor Tony Allen. Tony Allen took me under his wings early on in my career. Tony Allen was a profound guy at the School of Oriental African Studies, SOAS, in London, University of London, and he took me under his wing, and he gave me a role as a lecturer at SOAS. And Tony Allen was moved by an important question that was asked in about the 1980s. And the question was, will the wars of the next century be fought over water? That's the question that he was interested in. So Marlon Falkenmark's working on the hydraulic density of population, and Tony Allen's working on this matter. And I'm in between this little lot, meeting people and picking their brains and learning about stuff. So let's tie this together. Tony Allen's work came to the conclusion that there is more water flowing into the Middle East embedded in food, embedded in wheat from the American Midwest, Kansas, the Canadian prairie provinces, more water embedded in wheat than flows down the River Nile every year. And he came to the conclusion that there will be no water because water, A, it's so cheap, it's not worth fighting over, and B, the easiest remedy is to just import the foodstuffs. So national food security, he became the national food security guy. Very interesting. But then he taught me something that Marlon added to later on. And he taught me the following. And he said, a person needs 1 liter per day to survive. 1 liter. If you can get 1 liter a day, 2 liters, you do pretty well. 2 liters per day, you'll survive. You need 200 liters per day, per person per day, to live a quality life, to bath, to flush the toilet, to prepare food, to cook and wash up your cooking utensils after. 200. So from 2 per person to 200. That's small water for survival. Medium water, that's the water provided by the water corporations, the municipalities. They provide that 200 liters per person per day. But then the big water, is water for food. For every calorie of food needed is 1 litre of water. And if you take a scanty diet of 2,000 calories, that's a scanty diet. That's 2,000 litres of water, 2 tons of water per person per day. That's a scanty diet. A lot of Americans eat 4,000. They eat 4 tons of water per person per day just to stay in their hamburgers and all that kind of stuff. And he came up with the concept of virtual water. And my master's degree was actually on virtual water, quantifying the virtual water flows in southern Africa around the Zambezi River. So my master's thesis was about the Zambezi River as a virtual water sort of entity. But having now learnt about virtual water and the fact that the wars in the next century are unlikely to be fought over water, working now with Marlon Falkenmark, she came up with this notion of a water barrier. And she came to the conclusion that there is indeed a finite limit to the number of people that a given unit of water can carry. And she called that the water barrier. And 1,000 people per flow unit per annum is as much as a modern society can sustain without losing social cohesion. 1,000 people per flow unit, per billion cubic meters of water. The only country in the world that was capable of going beyond that at that point in time was Israel, which was a very small country, a very centrally controlled country, highly dedicated people. From a country perspective, the Perth Water Corporation would cover their entire footprint quite easily. So their Mekarot, their water utility, their national water utility is a fraction of Perth Water Corporation, which is a fraction of Rand Water is. So these are scale, orders of magnitude difference in complexity. So the conclusion that he came to, that Marlon came to, was that the most significant thing in dealing with water scarcity, water constraints, from an economic growth and social stability perspective, is understanding this water barrier. And she coined the concept of a second order resource. And that's what I used in my water as a national security model. So water, think of land, think of fundamental inputs into your national economy as first order resources. You've either got a lot of water or you've got a little bit of water. You've either got a lot of minerals or a little bit, a few minerals. So West Australia's got not much water, but massive minerals. So our first order resource availability is high. Now our second order resource is what I eventually defined as social adaptive capacity. How do we adapt to changes in that water profile over time? So here we've got people settling around Perth, more and more people settling, more and more waste flowing, more and more, all kinds of issues around deforestation, changing of hydrological flows, changing of groundwater tables. One of the questions is about the Nangara Mound. We'll talk about that now. Changing of these water depths, and how do we adapt to that? If we can keep on adapting to that, we're on that treadmill that I said. We're on that treadmill, and our overzealous trainer, is turning it up. Because we're sweating now, but we've got to keep going. So that's what it is. So the significance is that in the future, it will be second order resources that are determinant. And yesterday I gave a lecture at the Engineering Institute of Technology down in Perth, and I gave a talk different to this one now. And there I spoke about the future that I see is going to be a fusion between ordinary engineering, the engineering of pipes and pumps and dams and flows and pressures and stuff like that, and the integration of that with natural, let's call it nature-based solutions, and also the integration of that in a hybrid form with digital platforms. Artificial intelligence. I'm an ex-intelligence guy. I understand data. I understand that data is meaningless on its own. You want to be able to extrapolate. You want to be able to call the shot. You want to be able to call it. And getting back to my, because I'm going down the rabbit hole now, I'm jumping around. Getting back to my relationship with John Braithwaite, he said to me that, I asked him, why are you interested in me? What about me? Why me? And he said, because you understand complexity. You come from a place where complexity, we deal with curveballs every day there. Australia's stable state. stable state. We don't understand complexity. We don't understand what happens when things get upset, when the apple cart gets upset. And he said, we need you here. And I asked him, are you offering me a job? And he said, do you want it? And I said, gee, I was blown away. I was 65 years of age and someone's offering me a job. And I thought, oh, that's profound. And that's actually one of the reasons why eventually I came to Australia, because I see that this is a place where there's opportunities. And getting back now to the present, so the future of water in this part of the world is going to be the development of that technical capacity to integrate predictive systems, predictive models, and to be able to call out changes in system dynamics before they happen. And now I'll go back down the rabbit hole and I'll come up somewhere else and I'll tell you about that. So before I left South Africa, I was appointed as a director of a company down in Stellenbosch. And Stellenbosch was a very interesting company. It was a high-tech startup company, and they were doing the kind of thing that Google likes to do, creating brand new things from scratch. And they had a very wealthy benefactor behind them, and he was willing to throw money at this. And we started developing, we firstly started recruiting people from the South African arms industry. And if you know anything about weapons manufacture, you'll know that what the Americans take 20 years to do, the South Africans would do in 12 months because they had to do it. They had no choice. So when the Americans made this fancy attack helicopter, the South Africans made a Roy Falk, and not only could it do what the American Apache can do, it could also hover upside down. So that's what South Africans could do. South Africans have this ability to create enormously creative people. And with the capital we had behind us, a very wealthy, high net worth South African guy threw a lot of money at us, and we got involved in the sugar industry, the sugar and ethanol industry. And COVID hit us at that time, but we started developing mathematical algorithms to understand how sugar is converted from cane going into a mill, and eventually to either ethanol or to crystalline product coming out, and all the steps in the process. And we started developing algorithms. We developed like what is now known as a digital twin of that whole process. And we now realize that we can go upstream of that process. So, for example, one of the problems in the sugar industry is the fouling of heat exchangers. Falling film evaporators, they get calcified. And so what is the calcification problem? We went down that rabbit hole and we found that it's actually all about calcium carbonate. It's about calcium and toxicity. Because South African soils are acidic in nature, they throw huge quantities of dolomitic limestone, calcium and magnesium carbonate. They throw into the soil. Calcium builds up in the soil. It becomes toxic over time. Plants start having to deal with that toxicity, and they build up oxalic acid. So oxalate and the falling film heat exchangers were now being fouled by oxalate, and then we worked on oxalate, and we found that oxalate is the same thing that you get in your kidney stone. So a kidney stone is when you've got too much oxalic acid in your body, and you now form a kidney stone, which is one of the hardest known substances. And guess what? A kidney stone to a human is exactly what a falling film evaporator blockage is, in a calandria tube to the sugar industry and any other heat exchanger, industrial heat exchanger. So we cracked all of that open and we said, right, what if we can model this, and what if we can tell the mill when they are going to start getting sugar from that particular block? Because we can map the whole supply chain, and we can say, right, that supply chain, because it's low in elevation, all of the calcium is going to eventually flow there. You're going to have a buildup of calcium. Therefore, the oxalic acid in that batch is going to be higher than there. So we can start predicting that in the next week, 2 weeks from now on Tuesday, you're going to get a batch from this place, and it's going to have a higher oxalic acid. So anticipate. Either got to blend it out with something else, or anticipate now that that you're going to get blockages. And we started getting into the predictive stuff. And then from there, we started working on algorithms. We said, well, if we can do this, we eventually got into one of the sugar mills, a massive sugar mill that converts brown sugar into refined white sugar. And we could solve some of their fundamental problems, but through mathematical applications, but not using any available software over the counter. So we developed all of those things ourselves, which is now kind of stupid if you think about it now, because a lot of those things are available commercially now. But nonetheless, we developed that at that point in time. And the important thing was we were able then to predict with 90% accuracy system changes to system dynamics 2 hours before they happened. So imagine if you're flying in a jumbo jet and suddenly you can predict that 2 hours from now, you're going to have an oil pressure problem in that turbine. You can do something about it now. So that's 2 hours enables you to do something differently. So now we get to this, back to this, where we are today. Why is this all relevant today? Why is this all relevant? And I see the future now of the world as follows. The first thing is we have reached the limit of our freshwater availability on the planet, period. Of the total volume of water on the planet, 97% is seawater. 2.5% is fresh water. And of that 2.5% fresh water, a chunk of it is tied up in ice, and a chunk of it is tied up in groundwater. The Nangara Mound, for example, a chunk of water there tied up. Can you get it out? Maybe. All sorts of complexities. You can put a board down, you can get it out, but economics and all kinds of other things kick in. So the bottom line is we've reached the limit of our water availability in fresh water. But our population is growing. Getting back to Marlon Falkenbach's work now, hydraulic density of population, we are outstripping our available water supply, period. Fact. So now I'm going to tell you another story. So here, Turton finds himself addressing the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. And because Turton is an intrepid person, and sometimes he doesn't know his limitations, he decided at a whim to look at all the esteemed guests in the room and to say to them roughly the following: I am humbled to be in your presence, but I'm going to challenge you today, and I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to please, just by show of hands, tell me if I'm talking nonsense or not. And I said to them roughly the following. I said, our fundamental problem with water is we have been managing water as a stock, which is a finite volume, and a single-use entity that we throw away as waste. So it's a linear economy, and we use it once. And I said, but I'm looking at you professors now, in this room of the Nobel people, and I'm asking you now, am I wrong in saying that the volume of water we have on the earth today is the same volume as we had when the dinosaurs roamed freely? And therefore, ma'am, that what you're drinking there now went through a dinosaur's kidney 60 million years ago. It went through a dinosaur's kidney, and what you're drinking there probably went through someone else's kidney a month ago. And therein lies the good news. Water is a flux that flows in time and space. It is an infinitely reusable resource. And that's the aha moment. So Marlon Falkenbach's thing is important because it tells us that when we get to that point, that threshold, we've got to start doing things differently. So that now we get to the technological capacity, and we can now jump around a bit more because it's fun to jump around. Look at what's happening in America today. Harvard University just lost a whole bunch of its government funding. Top frontline university, developing all kinds of patents and things because it's being politicized. Education and knowledge is being politicized. What's happening in Australia? Does Australia have the technical capacity, the university capacity? Do you have the leadership skills at professor level to start asking these provocative questions? To start going beyond the limit, to start going into that area of discomfort? Because when you talk about civilization, we've got to talk about some uncomfortable things as well. So do we have that ability to start asking the questions? Because I'm going to sort of wrap up by saying that the fundamental thing about water is that water challenges us with a dilemma. And we all know that a dilemma is something for which all alternative solutions, in inverted commas, are equally unappealing. That's why you refer to sitting on the horns of a dilemma. So our role, when I teach my students, when I work with smart people, I tell them that our role, their role, is to convert that dilemma into a series of problems, because problems are your friends. Problems are good things. Problems are technically soluble. And I just watched Elon Musk give a talk a while ago about how he redefined fundamental problems and how he learned how to ask the right question. And as a leader, you've got to ask the right question. As an institution, you've got to have a leadership team that asks the right question and enables the right processes to unfold in order to solve that problem. And I would say that the right question now is about water as a flux. How do we recycle, reuse water the multiple times that we can? And now we get into an absolutely interesting space, because I know in Western Australia, I know that there's some really interesting things happening here. So I'll just give you some comparison. I'm doing some work at the moment in Cape Town, and I live in Perth. I live very close to the Beanie Up wastewater treatment works, and I know that they recycle a whole bunch of waste. I was there where they were commissioning the plant some years ago, and I was just amazed by what they were doing. I took photographs, and I speak about it wherever I go in the world. So here you have a cutting-edge technology. And the brine that comes out of that process, because you treat all this wastewater, you treat it, take all the nasty stuff out, and you've got a significant volume. In those days, they were talking about 120 megalitres per day, 120 million litres of water per day that they were recovering. I don't know what it is now. I haven't been back lately, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's not 200. So a significant amount of water is being recovered. But what is rejected? The reject water, there is concentrated brine, and it's got all the nasties in it. It's got chemicals, it's got medication, it's got antidepressants, it's got all these kind of things that society has. And so where do we get rid of that? That's a cutting-edge problem. That's a cutting-edge technical problem that has to be answered. And the work I'm doing in the Middle East right now, where they do a lot of desalination, we're trying to reframe the problem. We're trying to say, how do you reduce the management of brine? Or more importantly, I was talking to a Saudi a while ago, and the Saudi said, no, you Western guys have got it all wrong. You Western guys are coming up with business models that say we take seawater, and we're going to take the salt out of the seawater, and we're going to produce very, very cheap drinking water that no one's willing to pay for. Because in Islamic law, in Sharia law, water's got no economic value. It's a gift from Allah, peace be upon him. So you don't charge for it. So you've got all these fantastic, chemical engineering processes, and you're producing water that people take for granted and aren't willing to pay for it. And he said, no, what we've got to think about doing rather is, how do we frame that problem in a different way? How do we concentrate salt to the point where we can mine the ingredients of that salt as chemically pure minerals, and then sell those chemically pure minerals, rare earths, whatever you want to call them? How do we sell that into the marketplace? How do we mine seawater? How do we sell that off? And then as a byproduct, the waste product of that is potable water, drinking water. Now it's a waste, so we're going to discharge that. And then if any municipality wants to come and sign an offtake agreement, they get the offtake agreement, and we take care of our waste that way. So it's about how we think of the problem. The way we define the problem defines the solution that we go for. So I'm working with a group of people now where we're looking at this whole artificial intelligence network. We're looking at throwing or developing the capability of, for example, in the case of Australia, Western Australia, it would be to throw a blanket over an entire area. So let's take Water Corp, for example, the entire geographic footprint of Water Corp, but then looking even beyond that, where does Water Corp supply to, where does it interface with mining companies, etc. What are the issues there? But how do we throw a blanket across that whole thing? And how do we now, through Internet of Things stuff that's all readily available today, how do we measure the water level in the Ngara Mound? How do we measure the quality of that water? How do we measure the dynamics to know how high it is, how low it is, how it's going to be changing over time? And how do we compare that now, or combine that with the water recovery from Beanie Up that's pumped into the Lido aquifer where it's banked for 25 years? How do we understand that? How do we quantify that? How do we start calculating mathematically values that can be traded as derivatives? So how do we start creating water futures? How do we start creating tradable water credits that can now start becoming an alternative revenue stream to fund all of this funky stuff we're talking about? So that's where the industry is starting to go now. And it's very exciting. And I will just mention another of my esoteric friends. I can't think of his name now, but he was a professor that I met at Oxford University. Profound guy. He was a Dutch man, in fact a Belgian man. I'll think of his name now. And he was doing work into the Spanish hydraulic mission. And the Spanish of a very interesting nation. This is a nation that was at the height of their power in the 1700s. And they've been on this long, slow decline of empire since then. After they discovered the New World, they're on the way out. But they're very proud people, and they believe in what he called pushing rivers around. They believe in taking water from here and putting it there through big pipes and intermittent transfers, etc. And his work was on the hybridization of ecosystems. So how humans co-evolve with the ecosystems that they are adjusting, they are changing. So how do humans actively produce or generate alternative ecosystems? How do we hybridize ecosystems? And how do we understand those hybridized ecosystems? And how do we minimize the unintended consequence of all of that fiddling around with nature? Because every act of fiddling around with nature has got implications. So these are some of the interesting sort of aspects about water. So every time I look up into the skies, I think about this journey that I've been on. I think about the flow of water in the Okavango. I'm about to go on a journey with my son. We're going to go across the Nullarbor Plain. We're going to go to the East Coast in a 4x4. And it's the second time we're doing it. And it's just an amazing journey. And I just look forward to that, getting together with my family again. But that whole journey is determined by understanding of water. Water on this ancient landscape. Water that has enabled civilizations to survive long before modernization has come in and changed it. And the question now is, how do we co-evolve with those traditional communities and modern communities? How do we bring those traditional communities into a modernization future in a way that is acceptable to them, culturally acceptable, to minimize risk? All ultimately comes down to managing risk. So the important take-home message is that water is not one thing. Water is multiple things. There's not one truth about water. There are multiple truths about water. Water is as complicated or as simple as you choose to make it. So water has a spiritual value. You go to a church and you get cleansed. And every culture on the planet practices a cleansing ritual. So whether you're a Christian church or whether you're Jewish, or whether you're Muslim or Hindu, it doesn't make a difference. Water has got cleansing capabilities. And that's one of the things. So I'm going to wrap up by saying that my work with Aaron Wolf about the Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database found the following. There are far more examples, empirical examples of countries cooperating over water than fighting over it. In fact, of this entire Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database, something like maybe 100 incidents were recorded where water was a cause of war. You get lots of incidents where water is captured as part of war. The dam busters, where the dam busters went and shot the dams up. That is water as a weapon of war. The Angolan veterans know Kalawek and that sort of these are weapons. These are targets of war. That's a different thing. And we know that in times of protest, water is an important thing. But underlying this, what happens is water amplifies underlying tensions in society. So if there's a tension in society, you better believe it, that water's going to bring that tension out. And this is where you start getting to that predictive capability. What if we can predict? What if we can get a bit of a heads up around this thing? Start developing a solution before it becomes a punch up. I'm involved in Cape Town at the moment, and the issue in Cape Town now is the discharge of raw sewage through marine offshore pipelines. And they are very fascinated because I'm looking at these marine offshore pipelines here off Mullaloo Beach, and they're fundamentally different in design, and they're different. Here I heard of one local resident complaining about something, and Water Corp does something about it. So it becomes an issue. Immediately, they spring into action. They do something about it. In Cape Town, ongoing battles, hundreds of activists. The government denies, deflects, and demonizes. That's what they do. They deny it exists, they then deflect it to something else, where they then demonize a professional that's getting involved in it. So they don't solve the problem. So here you've got two chalk and cheese situations. And I think the important thing is, in the future, how are we going to resolve these issues? But the good news is that because water is a flux, moves in time and space, as long as we have human ingenuity, we can solve those problems. And the even greater news is the fact that because of the way that Australia's geography is, geography matters. And for those of you that went to school and maybe were not excited about geography, geography does matter. And one of the reasons it matters is because human population development in Australia tends to be centered around the ocean. So most people live within 100 kilometers of the ocean, or very close to the ocean. And that is in a pipeline's distance of the ocean. So the good news is the seawater desalination, I'm very bullish on that. Seawater desalination is the way to go. And working in Melbourne and comparing Melbourne now to Cape Town, Cape Town went through a crash and burn because they refused to desalinate seawater. And they came with these fictitious stories, it's too costly and it's environmentally unfriendly. So it's too costly compared to what? Compared to a crashed economy, compared to investor confidence that falls flat and people migrate their capital. So too costly compared to what? You've got to compare it to something. Okay, so it's not too costly at all. And in fact, what I learned in Melbourne is that when you start desalinating seawater, you go into a completely different domain, because an unintended consequence of desalination on a large, I'm talking now about a utility scale, is that you don't have to drive your inland water resources so hard. You don't have to drive your rivers, your aquifers, you don't have to drive them so hard. And therefore they leave them alone and they naturally come back. Nature's got a way of naturally healing itself. So that's the sort of, that's the message. I'm going to wrap up now. I'll gladly take any questions if there are. I've been on a bit of a nebulous journey, but I hope you followed me in my nebulosity, and I'll gladly answer any question. Just before I go, these are some of the books that I've been involved in developing. So this is a book, it's a sanitation atlas of Africa. So we were the first people to actually come up with this idea of, it's a United Nations project, but my team was involved in this. So understanding the water as a sanitation issue on the continent of Africa, doing all the technical maps and stuff like that. And coming out of Aaron Wolf's Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database, we got involved in the first, also United Nations project, the first atlas of river basins in the world. And so this is the African river basins, and we put the whole book together. But basically, all the maps that are to do with the river basins, and then there's a whole bunch of other books here that are little bits and pieces. So thank you very much.
Tony, I think almost every person in the room is going to have a question. So you're going to be bombarded.
Can I have
officially submitted questions?
My mouth is dry.
And we're going to have a conversation with you. I think everyone wants to have a chat to Tony at some stage.
I'm in your capable hands.
First question.
Okay, so the simple question there, can India hold back all the water? The simple answer is no, not technically possible. Water flows. And if you know anything about water, have you ever seen that little image of that little Dutch kid? Because half of Netherlands is below sea level. And then there was this one little Dutch kid who saw water leaking out of a dike, and he put his finger in there, and his finger got stuck, and he's now the symbol of Dutch water. Did you know that in Holland, democracy has grown up in Holland around what's known as a waterschappen. And the waterschap is a water utilities organization to manage flooding. They manage flooding events. So it's not physically possible to build a dam to restrict the flow of water. The cost, first it takes you 20 years to build a dam. The dam doesn't happen in 10 years if you're lucky. It doesn't just happen instantly. It's not as though the troops could go there a month ago and suddenly build a big device and take the water. It's not physically possible. So that's an emphatic no. Okay, have you ever watched any videos of the Indian and Pakistani army on border duty in the Kashmir region? And you'll notice a couple of things. Now, those guys that come from Africa, you'll know what a trapsikis is, what a chameleon is. And when you get two chameleons that come together, they go into this posture. They puff themselves up, and they make themselves look big, and then they meet over a stick. So there's a stick in the middle here, and the one chameleon stands here, and the other chameleon stands like 180 degrees out of phase with it. So they now dance around the stick, but they never touch each other. So it is symbolic. It is symbolic action. And getting back to this transboundary freshwater dispute database work that we did, what we found there from scientific evidence is the following. The probability of an individual picking up a Kalashnikov and doing something about it increases the closer you get to the individual that's affected. So conversely, it decreases the further you go from the individual and the closer you get to the government, because governments have got more options available than the individual farmer has. So that's the one thing. The second thing that we know is that the underlying tensions in society are always magnified by water. So whenever those tensions exist, they'll always be there. So if you get back now to the India-Pakistan thing, you'll see that what they've done is they've ritualized the conflict. And the finest soldiers, they stand the tallest, they're proud, they're like peacocks. You know,
I've seen them.
Yeah, they literally preen like peacocks. But it's all ritualized conflict. They're not going to nuke each other. I can promise you, they're not going to nuke each other. So I'm not worried about that. Okay.
Well, something local.
Okay. The state of Nangara's mound. Now, I'm not an expert on Western Australian water. I do know a couple of things. So the one important thing that I know is that rainfall is relatively low. It's concentrated in the southwestern part where we are, and it's concentrated in groundwater. So groundwater is very important. So there are a couple of mounds, there are a couple of water sources. Nangara is one of them. The Leaderville Aquifer, which is a deeper aquifer, which is very important. That's a confined aquifer. Nangara is an unconfined aquifer. So being unconfined, it's subject to water interaction from the surface. So it gets recharged actively. And one of the things that I've noticed here, in fact, I walk around taking photographs of it and posting it on Facebook because I'm amazed at these things. And I've got a following on Facebook. One of the things that I photograph is on every little block, every block in the suburb in Western Australia, you get a corner stand and it's got a great big depression there. And that great big depression is a water catch pit. And all the water from the roads goes into that catch pit. And the house I live in, the water off the roof goes into the ground, it goes straight into a catch pit. So my understanding is the building codes here don't allow you to discharge water into the street. So all of that is groundwater recharge. So there's an active groundwater recharge taking place here. And I would argue that that's one of the sophisticated things about Perth city planning. They're actually very sophisticated when it comes to this kind of thing. So I've got no concerns about that. However, when you've got a growing population, and particularly cars using the road, cars are depositing oil and tire residue and stuff like that, that's getting polluted. So that shallow groundwater gets polluted very quickly. So I would argue that groundwater is probably becoming polluted. I know when I go walking or running out in the community, I can immediately see where a bore is in use, because you can see the concrete on the pavement is rusty. You know that this bore water with high level of iron, and that's what it is. So the water quality is not that good, but it's obviously it's an important resource, and the good news is it can be treated and processed. So we now get into an interesting concept, and the concept is about the multiple use of water. So what I call a dual stream reticulation system, where you use water of different quality and different price for different purposes. So does it make sense to flush your toilet with drinking water? No. So you get grey water harvesting, that's going to become a thing of the future. And I don't know if they practice it here. I don't know if the building codes are allowed, but I know in South Africa, the building codes don't get allowed. But I know of big companies that are real estate developers that develop high-rise buildings. They are building that into their planning well ahead of what the regulator requires, because that dual stream reticulation is going to be a thing of the future. Okay, so I presume you're talking about the underground aquifer that's... Okay, so it's an artesian basin, so what does it tell us? So it's artesian, so what does artesian mean? So artesian means it's a confined aquifer. It's confined, it's got a hard rock layer at the bottom, it's got some other stuff in between, it's got water in it, and then it's got a confined layer on top. And that's, I'm learning about the geology of Australia, and my understanding is there used to be a big inland sea there at some point in time. There was an ocean, and that's where, for example, the shale gas and the coal deposits all come from that inland ocean at that point in time. So it's a significant resource. Are the Chinese coming? I don't see that. I don't see the viable to use groundwater for a strategic resource like food security. I just don't see it happening. Getting back to Tony Allen's work on virtual water, the water that's embedded in food, it doesn't make sense for a desert country to export its scarce water in food to another country. It just doesn't make sense. So I don't see that happening. What I do see, and I see this all the time, is that people conflate issues. So they have got a natural suspicion, in this case of the Chinese hegemony. They've got a natural suspicion, and therefore they conflate that suspicion of, oh, they're coming to take our water. And possibly they could, but I think, through clever negotiations, you can safeguard yourself against that. So I'm personally not overly concerned about that.